Hi lovely ones. The thing that really interests me about using editing software, the reason that I wanted to be able to kind of cut my videos a little bit and do kind of like jump cuts, I suppose you call them, is because when you don't use editing software and you're putting out a lot of thoughts or information or whatever, you have to really be clear on what you're going to talk about, and you can't really go off into some kind of stream of consciousness exploration. I have been able to do that occasionally, but sometimes I stop myself because I'm aware that I'm not talking for a really long time and there's no way to cut that out. So kind of while I'm gathering my thoughts and stuff, I need to kind of be on the ball, and the reason that I wanted to use editing software is so that I could have those moments of verbal exploration and just let myself go off on one, and then kind of, if it didn't make much sense, I could kind of cut to the thing I was trying to say. So that's really the delight for me in being able to use editing software, and that brings me to the video that I'm going to do today. I've been meaning to talk about Jung and his influence on me for a really long time on the channel, but it's something that every time I try and do it, or every time I do it with people in my life or online with people, it does go down many different avenues and it can be really difficult to stay on task with the conversation. And that's because it's such a mammoth subject, and it's something that really makes me feel very explorative, and that can cause me to not be all that articulate and all that controlled and restrained in my speaking. So I'm gonna make that video now because I don't want to have notes, and I don't want to kind of be really constructed about what I'm discussing. I want to just let myself flow, because that's how I like to do things when I'm talking about something that I'm hugely passionate about. So today I'm just going to kind of let myself talk about Jung, and hopefully it will be illuminating for those of you who do want to learn more about him, or enjoyable for those of you who do know about him and have read anything by him or are just fascinated by his ideas. So that's kind of the order of the day. Okay, so I discovered Jung when I was about 14 or 15. My mum was going through therapy at the time, and she was working with an analyst who, if she wasn't a Jungian analyst, then she certainly took a lot of inspiration and insight from Jung. And she encouraged my mother to read The Women Who Run with the Wolves, and then my mother tried to encourage me to read that book for like 15 years, and I finally did. So my mum became interested in Jung, and she picked up his memoir, Memories, Dreams and Reflections, and she took it with her on holiday. We went on holiday to Gran Canaria when I was 15 and 14, 15? Yeah, 15. Yeah, 15. And my mum asked me to read some of it to her while she was sunbathing. She really likes my reading voice. And so she was kind of like laid out with her bikini, just loving life, soaking up the sun, and I picked up this book and I started reading some of it for her. And I instantly fell in love with this man. I remember really clearly the first thing that I read by him, and it was a memory from when he was 2 or 3 years old of his mother soaking bread in milk and feeding it to him, and he was kind of writing about the smell of it, and that book really just dropped me into my own heart and kind of made me feel really alive and really kind of more curious about my own life and my feelings about my own life. And it really just started from there, and then I kind of, as I got a bit older, started to read about various different ideas from Jung, and something just clicked, and he's been in my life ever since. Individuation really interests me. Jung's theory of individuation is really the whole animal. It's the overarching goal of Jungian analysis, and individuation is really, it's so much more about becoming whole than it is about changing. It's not about shedding, it's about accepting, it's about embracing. And the interesting thing about individuation is that once you have kind of become whole, once you've grasped all of these different areas of the psyche and made your peace with them, and rather than trying to push them out or change them or morph them into something else, you kind of brought them together into something coherent, something that is fully conscious. Every part of you is fully conscious. At that point, things do begin to change quite often, but change isn't the aim. Change isn't the aim, acceptance is the aim with individuation. So that's really interesting to me, and I do talk about change, you know, like making positive change and what kind of changes do you want to make in your life and stuff, and I don't think there's anything bad about that whatsoever. I think that's a really important exploration. But the interesting thing for me is that the baseline with everything that I do with my clients and with myself is individuation. And individuation really isn't that much about conscious change. It's not about fixing. It's not about kind of rearranging or cutting things off, you know, cutting off the fat and the excess or the nasty bits. It's really about looking at them, facing them, acknowledging them, embracing them. And that's what really excites me about the individuation process. And the whole idea of it is that if you've got a handle on yourself and you see yourself consciously as a whole being, you see all parts of your psyche, then it helps you with the dynamics with other people, and it helps you with the dynamics in your relationship with yourself. Everything becomes better once you stop trying to hide certain pieces of yourself away, and, you know, once you become everything that you can become, because it's already within you. It's really about contacting those places and, as I said, accepting them and embracing them. I think individuation and actualization, self-actualization, have an interesting relationship with each other. Because to me, self-actualization is this idea of finding purpose, finding meaning, understanding kind of what your sense of purpose is, your drive, and also self-actualization is about really embracing the power of your potential. And at the moment when you self-actualize, life just becomes better. And I think individuation and self-actualization, even though they're different, they share the same stem, they share kind of the same nucleus, they're two parts of the same animal. And so that's why I'm really excited by the idea of self-actualization too, although Jung's idea was individuation, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. Jung came up with this idea of projection, and I know a lot of people talk about projections and talking about how they're projecting or how somebody else is projecting. And projection is really just this idea that if there's something in you that's unacceptable, that you don't want to acknowledge, that's, you know, kind of something in your ego or in your unconscious which is uncomfortable for you, the way that you choose to deal with it is by seeing it and by kind of acknowledging it. But because you're scared to do that in yourself, you see it in somebody else, you kind of single it out in somebody else, and you can talk about it freely then, and you can attack it freely then, and you can kind of be disparaging about it or repulsed by it or disgusted by it. But actually it really only just mirrors something that's in you. And actually quite a lot of the time projection is where you see something in somebody else, and indeed it's really not even in them, or it is in them, but it's really also within you. And if you were to kind of bring it back to the self and address how you're doing it and why you're doing it, you wouldn't even be concerned about somebody else's issues. You know, it's really about, projection is about being fearful of doing work in the self. So instead it's easier to other, it's easier to kind of decenter. You don't want the work to take place within you, so you kind of see that yucky part in somebody else and you kind of amplify it and you attack it. But really it's about the self, as most things are. You know, most things are about what's going on within. And I think sometimes nowadays the idea of projecting has been kind of taken to an extreme. I think it's easy to tell somebody that they're projecting. I think it's a really kind of, it's a throwaway term sometimes now, which is a shame, because I don't always think that projection is what's happening. And I also think sometimes in my own life, this is something that I've noticed with me, I'll often see something in somebody or see something that somebody is doing, and I won't like it and it will get up my nose, but I notice that I'm not projecting something which is current within me. What I'm doing is I'm looking at something that somebody is doing that I used to do back when I didn't like myself very much, back kind of before I was healed and before I, you know, began my own journey towards self-actualization, which is obviously an ongoing process. But before I began that journey, there were a lot of things that I used to do that I don't do anymore, or that I catch myself in the act of doing them now, and I put things right, and I think to myself, oh, that's that part of myself that's, as soon as I suppress it, it gets out of control, so I need to kind of look at it and see that that's happening. When I look at other people, which happens less and less and less often, you know, the older I get. But when I do look at somebody else and feel irked by something that they're doing, sometimes I acknowledge that it's a projection from something current, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes what's happening is I'm seeing something that I used to do, or kind of the person that I used to be, and because I've gotten over that now, and because I've healed from that now, and because I realise now that it's not a good way to be, I get particularly irritated when I see that behaviour or that attitude, or, you know, that way of being in somebody else. So sometimes as well, I think there can be this thing where you project because of a judgment of your past self. And that is something that can have an emphasis on healing as well. When you see yourself doing that, it's very easy to judge others and to think, you know, I used to do that and then I got better and now I'm superior, or so it's still kind of something that you need to bring back to self. But I don't always think that projection is about something that's happening in the now. I've noticed that from my own life experience, that it's not always about something that's happening in the now. Sometimes it's about me seeing a little shard of my past self, which is alive and kicking in somebody else, and that irritates me too. But it's still kind of it's a decent invitation to shadow work and an invitation to show up for myself and work out what's going on there. And as many of you will already know, Jung and Freud had a very close relationship, very close friendship, professional and personal, and Jung was really inspired by Freud, and then they kind of broke, their relationship broke, and I'll talk about that probably in another video, kind of why that was. There were a few reasons why, and you know, Jung actually, the idea of projection, psychological projection, that was something that Jung was comfortable with, that he did take with him into his own work when he broke from Freud and set up his own school of analysis. He was fond of this idea of projection, and the idea that when, you know, the more conscious you become of yourself, the less you will project, and the more conscious you become of your own projections onto others, the less those projections will be damaging and harmful. And that's something that I really agree with, and that I notice in my own life and in other people's lives. And another really important thing to recognise about projection is that projection is not always negative. Quite a lot of the time when you really admire somebody, or when you really overtly respect somebody, that's also a form of projection. What you're really doing is, instead of being brave enough, instead of being bold enough to acknowledge the potential within yourself and really think, damn, I could really do something here, I am just so fucking amazing. If you're too scared to do that, if you're scared of success, or if you've kind of been conditioned to believe that it's arrogant or it's wrong to kind of love yourself and be impressed by yourself, you might project that admiration and respect onto somebody else. So projection can often show up in what would seem to be a positive way, and quite often when we actually undergo analysis or self-analysis, we see that that projection exists because we are too scared to actually look at the light within ourselves and harness that light within ourselves. So that, to me, is the other exciting thing about projection, that as I learned more about it, I realised that it could swing both ways, kind of thing. Jungian ideas have been through a major evolution. They've really been solidified and clarified by Jungian analysts who have written books about his ideas and have kind of fostered their own kind of beliefs about different techniques that can be used, and stuff like that. I think one of the most important things to understand about Jung before you even get started on learning anything about him is that what he gave us, what he gave to the world, was more of a philosophy than a set of techniques. He really allowed himself to write in a stream of consciousness style, and if you've ever read any of his work, you'll understand what I mean. He quite often contradicted himself, sometimes on the same page. Some people have noted that. He allowed himself to flow. And remember, psychology at that time was a really fringe practice. It was a fringe area. There weren't kind of the rules and the ethics and the standpoints and the overarching understanding that there is now. It was really just mavericks, you know, that were talking about looking at the human mind in this way and healing the ills of the human mind in this way. It was still a very fringe practice. Which you can kind of assume if you know anything about Freud and Jung having affairs with their patients, which they both did, then you'll know that kind of back then there wasn't that ethical foundation. You know, nowadays that you'd be struck off the register and it would be like an awful thing. But back then there wasn't that kind of moral kind of baseline. There wasn't that foundation. It was a totally fringe industry at that time, and as a result of this, and also as a result of Jung's psyche in general, he wrote in this really stream of consciousness style. It was like wading through thick, delicious, mystical, muddy water. And it's an exciting thing to read, but it's also very confusing. It's hard to get a handle on. It's hard to work out how to take the philosophies and actually turn them into techniques. He didn't really give us a lot of hard and fast rules for techniques to implement ideas like individuation and shadow work and typology and that kind of thing. So really what we've done is we've had kind of a really exciting era of Jungian analysts talking about it and working it out and simplifying it and clarifying it, baking it into these techniques and stuff. But I think what's really important to note is that if Jung was alive right now, he would quite probably correct quite a lot of those techniques, or would fundamentally maybe disagree with them, or he might say that some of them miss the point. And we'll never know, you know, and that's kind of the exciting thing about it. And a lot of people who favour Jung and follow his work and stuff will kind of debate with each other about, you know, which techniques actually fall into the Jungian idea, which techniques fall into that framework, and which actually are far outside of it. So what I would say is that it's important to take all of the different ideas on their own merit, and never really, this is what I would say, never ever think of a modern Jungian analyst or, you know, thinker or anyone like that, anyone that's a Jungian anything, never think of their books and their theories as the same as Jung's books and Jung's theories. They're not. They're inspired by, but they you know, they come from the same central foundation. But really, you know, I think what we're doing when we look at these techniques is we're actually just kind of, we're playing with a philosophy and we're turning it into something that's usable, that's understandable, that's solidified. There's really, what there is there's a desire to create consensus and develop dialogue around Jung's ideas. And as a result of that, there have been kind of these various different books come around that say, you know, this is what shadow work is, and this is how you do it, and these are the different techniques. But this is nothing that Jung actually kind of proposed. What we're doing is we're taking that central philosophy and we're kind of making it malleable. We're playing with it. We're allowing it to absorb into the psyche. But it would be really interesting to see, you know, these discussions. It would be really interesting to have Jung come back from the great beyond and actually kind of read some of these books and just see what he thought. And the great thing about it is that he would never be like hard and fast against anything that was working for people. For example, he came up with a system called Typology, where you could actually ask somebody a series of questions and kind of, as you go through psychoanalysis with them, you could work out an idea of their typological makeup. And I'll talk about that in a video. I promise I'll talk about it in a video. And basically what it is, it's a kind of spectrum that somebody kind of fits onto. And he always used to make a point of saying, don't ever be hard and fast about this stuff. Don't ever, you know, he used to say this to the analysts that he trained. He would say, don't ever find somebody's typological makeup and then constantly reference it. Don't think that because you've worked out a patient's typology, you know the essence of who they are, because you don't. Even people who hold a really strong and obvious typology, which is easy to work out, will have nuances that stray from that typology. He really used to stress that the psyche is complex. It is utterly fucking oceanic. And to kind of take a snapshot of it in a cute little, like, this is your typological makeup kind of thing, that is doing the psyche a disservice, and he used to be very clear on that. There's also a lot of other things that Jung used to be quite clear on that I think are often forgotten now by people who kind of profess an allegiance to his ideas. For example, I'm not sure exactly what the time kind of was, what the time limit was, but Jung used to be really into, like at his clinic in Switzerland, he used to be really interested in taking people on for daily psychoanalysis for a certain period of time, and it would be like I don't know, like 6 weeks or 2 months. I really can't think off the top of my head, but then he would always instigate quite a long measure of break, like a break between periods of psychoanalysis. So his theory was that if someone is going through psychoanalysis, they should be going through that every day, and it should be really intense, and it should be really kind of full on, and it should be addressing it every single day. And then you have a break for between 6 and 10 weeks or so. And during that break, that's the time for the patient or client to actually go out into the outer world, re-emerge into their situations and relationship dynamics, and kind of see how their complexes are doing, how things have changed. Have they dealt with their complexes? Have they become more individuated? How do they feel about these different things? So he really believed in letting go of the patient's hand and allowing them to re-enter the world and see the potential results of the analysis, and then meeting again after a period of quite a few weeks. This doesn't happen anymore. with Jungian psychoanalysis, or really with any psychoanalysis, and it's because of money, to be honest. It's a perfectly fine theory that Jung kind of put forth, but it wouldn't be very it wouldn't be ideal for therapists. You know, hey, go away for 10 weeks and see how you get on. No, you need money, you need to pay rent and stuff. And I think that's actually a shame, because I really see the sense in having those huge periods of time without analysis, without doing any of the work, so that you can see if the work has sunk in. And I think that's why so many people book things like in-depth tarot readings or an in-depth counselling session, rather than finding themselves a therapist they can go to every week, because sometimes you hinge your progress on that. Sometimes you become reliant on that weekly visit. And I think some people are so in touch with themselves that they know that what they actually need are 1 or 2 or 3 shots of hardcore introspection and self-exploration, so that they can then re-enter the world and see how that has come into being and how they are actually doing with that. I think quite often these days there are situations where people become dependent on their therapists, and I've spoken to people when I was going through my issues with self-harm and mental health and things. I've spoken to people who were so reliant, so dependent on their therapist that they would cry when their therapist went on their annual holiday. I think this is also the kind of thing that Jung was trying to avoid. It's obvious that he didn't know where his own line was with patients, because he did have extramarital affairs with patients. But I think on the other hand, he was very illuminated when it came to the idea that the idea of therapy itself is to finish therapy. You know, the whole process of therapy is with the express intention of allowing the patient to finish therapy and re-enter the world without the need for a therapist. You know, you don't want to get locked into that, you know, a therapist is a substitute for actual individuation. No, a therapist should be your ally as you get there, and then there should be that severing, and the severing is the sign of success. And I think that's really important to know. You know, I know somebody that went to a therapist for 10 years, the same therapist for a decade. Now, I feel in a sense something may have gone wrong there. A decade's a bloody long time. I want to state that with things like, on the NHS these days in this country, cognitive behavioural therapy is a really kind of, that's the therapy that gets all the funding. That's the therapy for people who are having psychological problems that the government trusts. And the reason for that is that it's so quick. There have been statistics, you know, and kind of studies done that prove that cognitive behavioural therapy can significantly increase somebody's well-being and mental well-being and feelings of happiness, etc. in just a 12-week stint. So the government are really keen on funding cognitive behavioural therapy. However, it's not effective for everybody, and this is something that I've been involved in lately, actually, is campaigning for different kinds of therapy and also for shorter waiting times for people who need therapy. So I would say, you know, it's not about, I'm not saying it's about speed. I'm not saying like, hey, you know, if a therapist can't sort you out in 3 to 6 months, then screw them. I just feel like sometimes there's a reliance, and because I knew this person personally who went to a therapist for a decade, you know, I knew that she could have severed the cord way before she did, and I just sometimes worry that therapists kind of depend on the relationship just as much as the patient or client themselves. And sometimes I just feel that it can be an unhealthy dynamic whereby we are forgetting that the severing, the lack of need for the therapist, that's the sign that the therapy has worked, you know. Not them revisiting for 10 years. That's, you have to wonder, where does it end, kind of thing. And I actually know a little something about that therapist as well, which kind of leads me to believe that was the case, that it wasn't entirely a healthy dynamic. Embracing Jung's ideas in a lot of ways is kind of interesting, because Jung encourages you to see your unconscious becoming conscious and work from that point. So for example, like sometimes I'm noticing in my life now that I'm posturing like my mother, and I'm saying things that my mother would say, and I'm kind of reacting to situations in ways that my mother would, and I catch myself in the act of doing that. That's my personal unconscious becoming conscious. Those systems and that way of being absorbed into my being when I was very, very young. Some of it absorbed prenatally, and some of it, you know, absorbed like as I was growing up and as I was in her aura and as I was kind of taking on everything that she was kind of putting out energetically and behaviourally. And when I see things come to the surface that are just so inherently my mother, or conversely my father, that is the personal unconscious coming to the surface. And the exciting thing about following a Jungian pathway is that it really encourages that kind of exploration, and it helps you to see how you have been constructed. Jung also kind of believed that this radical kind of idea at the time, this concept of every child being a blank slate and everything being about conditioning and nurturing and not about nature and not about kind of predetermined factors. Jung had a problem with this. He kind of went off the beaten track and kind of came to his own conclusions, and this is how we came to have archetype theory, because Jung was kind of stringently of the belief that even before we're born, even before we have any sensate function whatsoever, even before we enter the world, there are certain things that are imprinted into us purely by virtue of the fact that we're human beings. And he believed this for all species on the planet. So, you know, he saw that when a newborn creature of any species comes into this world, they expect the breast of the mother or the teat of the mother. They know who the mother is. They pick up the scent, and you know, the ducks know to like follow the mother and hide under the mother's wing, or you see birds fly in a V formation as they migrate south. These things are inherent, these things are inbuilt, they're archetypes. And anything that you see like that in life, you know, anything that seems to be a reality according to a universal inner pattern, that's what it is. It's a reality according to a universal inner pattern. It's some kind of energetic nucleus that is undeniable, that is there. Archetypes are organising principles, so they're kind of like their predispositions based around form or being. And when we talk about archetypes as like mother, father, sage, trickster, damsel in distress, you know, and there's all these modern ones as well that we have, and we just keep adding to it and adding to it. What we're really talking about are things that seem to be inherent in human knowledge, in the human psyche. It's a kind of library of symbolism that exists for us all. Now, our individual psyches and the way that we've individually been raised and our individual typologies will mean that we respond to the archetype of the mother, for example, differently from each other. But the archetype of the mother itself is non-negotiable. There will always be. The mother archetype will always be and has always been. And your individual response to it may be in light or in shadow, maybe healthy or unhealthy, maybe confusing or simplistic, whatever it is. But the archetype of the mother is the be-all and end-all. That it's there, it's an imprint. And Jung was very clear on this. And I think it's interesting, you know, because when I look at children and the way that children are raised, you know, like I see sometimes on TV, I only really watch TV when I'm with my mum and my sister. And quite often, when I've been with them, I've seen these shows like Super Nanny and stuff like that, where people talk about the best way to raise children. And children need this, children need boundaries, but children need a certain amount of freedom, and children need to know that this is happening, and children need... And it's all this talk about children need. And I just think to myself, this is crazy. Children have personhood. Children are their own little beings. And if you spend any time with children... You know already they have their own personalities, they're kind of growing their own typologies as we look at them, as we witness them living. So to me, it doesn't really make sense to talk about children as though they're all just this one breed and they all have the same needs and we deal with them all the same way. And so I kind of like that idea that kind of children are not necessarily born blank slates, and even if they are born blank slates, they receive personhood from the moment that they come into the world. If they are sponges, if everything is completely kind of picked up from the outside world, which was not Jung's belief. But even if that was so, why are we not treating children with personhood? Why are we not behaving as though they're individual and may have individual needs? But Jung didn't see it like that. He didn't believe that sexuality was all nurture. He believed it was nature, which is more what we're coming back to now. You know, we're kind of realising that that's just the way it is, and we're talking about things like how much hormone you're born with in the body, and different scientific studies which are kind of proving that it's not all about nurture. It's really, some things are just inbuilt, and I like Jung's idea that, you know, certain pieces of knowledge are inbuilt, certain ways of being. There's certain things we know from the very first moment, and that's what links us all together. The collective unconscious, you know, when you get down past the personal unconscious, there are these rivers of roots that form, that tangle all together, and we all drink from those same roots, and we're very, very different trees, and we're in very, very different places, you know. We're in different conditions, and we have to deal with different things, but the roots, when they go right down to the bottom, the roots are the same. They're all this interconnected network, and we are sucking them up. We're drinking from them. And that was his idea, that there was a certain plane of consciousness which was accessible to everybody, a cloud, if you will, where things are stored and have been stored for aeons, and we are born downloaded with that information. And it's really about how the psyche perceives it. But the psyche will perceive it one way or another. It is there. And it's just our individual state of being that kind of determines how we feel about it. If I say the word father to one person, they're going to have a very different emotional reaction than if I was to say the word father to another person. And this is not just based on what goes on in the personal conscious and unconscious, you know, your relationship with your own male templates. It's really about other things too. It's about how your unconscious reacts to these things, how your animus is kind of is interacting with you, and that's something that I'll talk about, probably not in this video, because I'm not really sure what I'm talking about in this video. I'm just going for gold. But yeah, you know, those interconnected networks, that's kind of where it is. And I'll link below to a video that I did on dream interpretation, and in that video I explain how Jung came to the idea of the collective unconscious through having a dream himself. And that's really intriguing and really interesting, and kind of makes things really simplified and easy to adjust to when you're thinking about the collective unconscious. So I'll do that for you, and that might be kind of an interesting thing for you to learn about too. The shadow is an archetype. The shadow itself is an archetype. It's something that Jung believed that all human beings have to one extent or another. We all have that stuff that we repress. We all have that stuff that we've been trained to repress. We all have that stuff that we hide away. And the shadow is ever changing. And really what we're doing is we're not trying to get rid of the shadow, we're trying to become conscious of it so that it doesn't have control anymore. This is the thing. Whatever you suppress predominates. This is really the rule. So it's kind of like the rule of economics. What goes up must come down. And then in the rule of psychology, it's whatever you suppress predominates. So, or whatever you resist persists. So, you know, really that it's an archetype too, and the beautiful thing about the idea of the collective unconscious is that the archetypes are universal aspects that we all share in common. And what this really means is that we all share something in common. We can come to understand each other. We can accept each other and each other's differences. There doesn't have to be conflict. There doesn't have to be a sense of shame. There doesn't have to be a sense of isolation. We don't have to be cut off from each other. We are not obligated to judge each other. We're not obligated to fry each other in the fire of criticism. We can appreciate that there are certain places where we overlap psychologically and spiritually and emotionally, and that's really the essence of archetypes. And so yeah, I guess the subject of archetypes is bigger than merely, I suppose, this kind of tarot way of looking at it, where you'd be like, well, you know, what are the archetypes? We've got mother, we've got father. I don't know why I'm being really posh. We've got mother, we've got father. Those archetypes, those figures, you know, and the way that we kind of interact with the meanings of those figures. But it's really a much bigger conversation than that. It's really about those universal patterns, realities which are predisposed and which actually kind of mark us out as the same, even though we try so hard to all be different. There is that, it's got a really collectivistic nature to it, which I love. I think it really just means that we are all we're all born of the same thing and we all go back to the same thing, and the cycle repeats, wash, rinse, repeat. There's something really spiritual about that, and there are many Jungian analysts who are very learned and have many degrees and have published many books, and they don't shy away from using the word spiritual. They don't, and that's really important for me when we're talking about Jung, because there is a spiritual facet to it. And I know a lot of people feel icky about, oh, well, we can't use the word spiritual because we're talking about psychology and it's about the mind and stuff. But no, there's something inherently spiritual about the idea of the collective unconscious. It is that feeling of overarching unity, and how deep can you go, and when you get to the bottom, are we really that different from each other? And there's something inherently spiritual about that. Why deny it? Why shy away from it? I don't think Jung would want us to do that, and I certainly am not going to if people who know way more than me about it and have absolutely dedicated their lives to it, if they're comfortable to say that it's a spiritual notion, then I am too, and so I think that's something that I would say. I'm gonna maybe do another video about Jung at another time. I'm gonna do loads, I think, because the editing software really does allow me to just and then kind of get rid of those parts where I'm like, what do I want to say next? What's next on my agenda? So that's great. It's just allowed me to streamline it a bit. I hope you guys don't find it impersonal. I just find that it helps me to make videos like this, which I've been putting off making for a really long time, because I only really talk about this subject in a certain way, and I figure I've got to be allowed to talk about it in that way. One thing I want to say is that when we talk about something transpersonal, what we're really talking about is something that goes beyond the individual self, something that goes beyond the experience of ego and actually taps us into what is beyond that. That's a really ham-fisted way of saying it, but I think really one of the principal things that's beautiful about Jungian thought is that we are encouraged to tap into mythology and fairy tales and folk stories and things like that. Because what that does is it allows us to have a transpersonal view of a personal event or relationship or situation. When we look at, you know, stories like the mustard seed in Buddhism, for example, where a woman loses her baby and she's absolutely distraught and she doesn't want to live anymore. She won't even let the baby go. She's holding the dead baby to her. She meets with the Buddha and she says, you know, how do I deal with this pain? And the Buddha says, I'll help you to deal with the pain and I'll help you to get over it. But first of all, I need you to go down into the town where you live and bring me a mustard seed from a house that has never experienced any death. And when you bring me the mustard seed, then I can help you. I'm sure loads of you know this story. So she goes down to the town and she visits from house to house and she asks for a mustard seed, and they each give her a mustard seed, and she says, before I take this mustard seed, have you had any deaths in this house? And at every house they say, yeah, I lost my father-in-law a year ago, or yeah, no, my brother died just last week. And that's where she realises, and she goes back up the mountain and she cries and she lets the baby go and she says, now I understand. That is a lesson in the transpersonal. In essence, that's what that is. What the Buddha used was he used transcendence above and beyond the ego to the place where you understand that you live in a world where these things occur, where these themes are overarching. It affects more than just you. It's bigger than just you. There is this overarching transpersonal lesson. You can elevate yourself beyond your own perspective. You can decenter, and you can recognise that, you know, when you look at pain from a transpersonal perspective, it's way better than if you look at it from a personal perspective. It just works. And the idea of tapping into myths and kind of mythopoetic structure is very important for looking at things from a transpersonal perspective. When we can look at stories that explain to us the things that are going on in our own lives, then we tap in to the idea that this is part of the human experience, that we need not despair, that we need not throw our hand and commit suicide, that actually this is part of the human experience, it's part of the human condition, and showing up for it is part of the work. So yeah, like that interests me quite a lot, the idea that myths are kind of concepts to help us understand ourselves, and kind of it personifies the templates that we're working with. It gives us some kind of like hook on which to hinge our understanding. And I was listening to a podcast a little while ago where somebody, like a psych major who does a podcast, he said that he finds that Jungian people don't seem to understand that the myths aren't real. Like, they talk about like, well, that's the Zeus in you, and he's like, why don't these people like kind of why do these people talk about gods or characters from stories and stuff as if they're real? And I found it kind of really interesting because in a sense they are. Like, the human imagination is really a way of mirroring the human experience. And so even though we're aware that that mythopoetic structure is from the human mind, essentially we can never know anything beyond that because everything is consciousness. For me, like, my matron and my favourite fairy tales and, you know, my favourite, like, characters from books, they're all real in a sense. They're all real. The imagination is a real place. It's where we go to get shit done. It's where we go to work things out. And it's where everything in this room came from. Everything in this, you know, everything man-made came from it. And so I think it's kind of interesting to note that there was something disturbing or icky for him about that, whereas to me it's like the most natural thing in the world. But yeah, I wanted to end this video at least by saying that the mythopoetic aspect of Jungian thought taps us into the transpersonal, and I really believe that no true healing can take place until we've elevated ourselves above our own sense of who we are and what life is, to transcend that and to become transpersonal. You know, that's where true healing is, and that's really one of the most potent parts of Jungian thought for me, and that's why I can't get enough of it. I'm going to end now. I've got so much more that I could say, but as I said, the only way that I could really get through this subject is to talk about it as though I would kind of, you know, talk about it with someone kind of in front of me who was saying, like, tell me what you know about Jung, and I would just kind of go off on one. There's no real way to structure it, so I decided not to. But I hope this has been helpful and interesting. I would love to know if you guys are interested in Jung, or you know, what you've read about him, or if you're planning on kind of researching into his ideas more. So yeah, you know, it's all kind of, it's something that I just love and that I just have always returned to. He really is my spiritual grandfather in many ways, and I thank him so much from the bottom of my heart for everything that he gave to the world, and how we can now kind of hinge our practices on those ideas and take those ideas further and continue to give tribute to him in that way. Okay, so much love, guys. Blessed be.